Hello Year 6 and welcome to our second day of reading this week. Now, the hobbits now have just managed to escape the Misty Mountains and they've just met Bjorn. And Gandalf is about to tell him his tale. But as you'll see, I think what he's going to do is he's going to try and make Bjorn quite curious so he'll help them. So let's read on and see how the dwarves and Gandalf get on with this new strange man, Bjorn. "Go on telling then," said Bjorn, who was never very polite. "There was a terrible storm. The stone giants were out hurling rocks, and at the head of the pass we took refuge in a cave, the hobbit and I and several of our companions." "Do you call two several?" "Well, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than two." "Where are they? Killed? Eaten? Gone home?" "Well, no. They don't seem to have come when I whistled. Shy, I expect. You see, we are very much afraid that we are rather a lot for you to entertain." "Go on, whistle again. I'm in for a party, it seems, and one or two more won't make much difference," growled Bjorn. Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were almost there before he had stopped, for if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes. "Hello," said Bjorn. "You came pretty quick. Where were you hiding? Come on, my jack-in-the-boxes." "Nori at your service. Ori at—" they began, but Bjorn interrupted them. "Thank you. When I want your help, I'll ask for it. Sit down and let's get on with the tale, or it'll be supper time before it's ended." "As soon as we were asleep," went on Gandalf, "a crack at the back of the cave opened. Goblins came out and grabbed the hobbit and dwarves and our troop of ponies." "Troop of ponies? What were you, a travelling circus? Or were you carrying a lot of goods? Or do you always call 6 a troop?" "Oh, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than 6 ponies, for there are more than 6 of us, and well, here are 2 more." Just at that moment, Balin and Dwalin appeared, and bowed so low their beards swept the stone floor. The big man was frowning at first, but they did their best to be frightfully polite, and kept on nodding and bending and bowing and waving their hoods before their knees, in proper dwarf fashion, till he stopped frowning and burst into a chuckling laugh. They looked so comical. "Troop was right," he said. "A fine comic one. Come on, my merry men, and what are your names? I don't want your service just now, only your names. And then sit down and stop wagging." "Balin and Dwalin," they said, not daring to be offended, and sat flop on the floor, looking rather surprised. "Now go on again," said Bjorn to the wizard. "Well, where was I? Oh, yes, I was not grabbed. I killed a goblin or 2 with a flash." "Good," growled Bjorn. "'Tis some good being a wizard then," and slipped inside the crack before it closed. "I followed them down to the main hall, which was crowded with goblins. The great goblin was there with 30 or 40 armed guards. I thought to myself, even if they were not chained together, what can a dozen do against so many?" "A dozen? That's the first time I've heard 8 called a dozen. Or have you still got more jacks and haven't yet come out of their boxes?" "Well, yes, there seem to be a couple more here now. Billy and Killy, I believe," said Gandalf, as these 2 now appeared and stood smiling and bowing. "That's enough," said Bjorn. "Sit down and be quiet. Go on, Gandalf." So Gandalf went on with the tale, until he came to the fight in the dark, the discovery of the lower gate, and the horror when they found that Mr. Baggins had been mislaid. "We counted ourselves and found there was no hobbit. There were only 14 of us." "14? That's the first time I've heard one of 10 leave 14. You mean 9, or else you haven't told me all the names of your party." "Well, of course, you haven't seen Oin and Gloin yet, and bless me, here they are. I hope you'll give them for bothering you." "Oh, let them come. Hurry up. Come along, you 2, and sit down. But look here, Gandalf, even now we have got yourself and 10 dwarves and the hobbit that was lost. That only makes 11. Plus 1 mislaid, and not 14, unless wizards count differently to other people. But now please get on with the tale." Bjorn did not show it more than he could help, but really he had begun to get very interested. You see, in the old days, he had known the very part of the mountains that Gandalf was describing. He nodded and he growled when he heard of the hobbits' reappearance, and of their scramble down the stone side, and of the wolf ring in the woods. When Gandalf came to their climbing into trees with all the wolves underneath, he got up and strode about and muttered, "I wish I had been there. I would have given them more than fireworks." "Well," said Gandalf, very glad to see his tale was making a good impression. "I did the best I could. There we were, with the wolves going mad underneath us, and the forest beginning to blaze in places, when the goblins came down from the hills and discovered us. They yelled with delight and sang songs making fun of us. 15 birds and 5 fir trees." "Good heavens," growled Bjorn. Don't pretend that goblins can't count. They can. 12 isn't 15 and they know it. And so do I. There were Biffa and Boffa as well. I haven't ventured to introduce them before, but here they are." In came Biffa and Boffa. "And me," gasped Bomber, puffing up behind. He was fat, and also angry at being left till last. He refused to wait minutes, and followed immediately after the other two. "Well, now there are 15 of you, and since goblins can count, I suppose that is all that you were up to it up the trees. Now perhaps we can finish this story without any more interruptions." Mr. Baggins saw how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Bjorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house, if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away, and he had never invited more than a couple of these to stay in his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting in his porch. By the time the wizard had finished his tale, and had told the eagles of the eagle's rescue, and of how they had all been brought to the Carrock, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the Misty Mountains, and the shadows were long in Bjorn's garden. "A very good tale," said he. "The best I have heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." "Yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." Inside the hall it was now quite dark. Bjorn clapped his hands, and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large long-bodied grey dogs. Bjorn said something to them in a queer language like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and struck in low brackets on the pillar of the hall above the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished, and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then, "Ba, ba, ba," was heard, and in came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their back trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on the trestle tables. These were very low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them a pony rushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms, and little short thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Bjorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he sat with his great legs struck far apart under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped section of logs, smoothed and polished, and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Bjorn's table, and the hall had not been such for a gathering for many a year. There they had supper, or dinner, such as they had not had since they left the last homely house in the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickered around them, and on the table were 2 small red beeswax candles. All the time they ate, Bjorn in his deep rolling voice told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to the north and south, a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east. The terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarves listened and shook their beards, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and that after the mountains it was the worst of the perils they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Bjorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke most of gold and silver and jewels and the making of things by smithcraft, and Bjorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs and the torches were put out, and still they sat in the light of dancing flames with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed to Bilbo that he heard a sound like wind in the branches stirring in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away, until he woke with a start. The great door had cracked and slammed. Beorn was gone. The dwarves were sitting cross-legged on the floor round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from east to west, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaken pool under heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly up stood Gandalf. "It is time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Beorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe, but I warn you all not to forget what Beorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found the beds had already been laid at the side of the hall, on a sort of raised platform between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly, summertime though it was. The fire burned low and he fell asleep, yet in the night he woke. The fire had now sunk to a few embers. The dwarves and Gandalf were all asleep. To judge by their breathing, a splash of white on the floor came from the high moon, which was peered down through the smoke hole in the roof. There was a growling outside, and a noise as some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was, and whether it could be Beorn in enchanted shape, and if he would become in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hid his head, and fell asleep at last, in spite of his fears. Okay, we're going to join the reading tomorrow to finish this chapter, and tomorrow we'll find out if Beorn is going to help them even further. So he's invited them in because he really liked their tale, and will he help them further with their quest? Join in to read with me tomorrow and find out.